Hi, how you doing? Food security and the price of produce is a hot topic these days. And so a lot of people are thinking about growing a vegetable garden, at least for a few months of the year to help out with that. But maybe you're new to growing vegetables, or maybe you're new to growing vegetables in a cold zone, or maybe you think they're too difficult to grow, or maybe you think you don't have the space to grow vegetables. There are many ways to grow vegetables, so I thought we'd chat about that today. My name is Sharon. I garden on a large yard in a small town in east central Saskatchewan, Zone 3. Welcome to my Sask Garden. So the first thing to consider is location. Whether you're growing in a conventional plot of land, raised beds, raised planters, pots, on your deck, it doesn't matter. Your where you situate all those vegetables, they're going to need 8 hours of direct sun every day, a minimum of 8 hours of direct sun every day. Some vegetables will benefit from a bit of shade throughout the day, and I'll get to that in just a bit. Now, specifically about cold zone growing with respect to vegetables, and how it's a little bit different. The reason that it's different, even if a zone 5 or zone 6 has a last frost date that is, not so much different than your own, maybe 2 weeks, say, let's just go with that. But that's 2 weeks of their soil being able to warm a little bit quicker than our soil does. And their sun is going to be just a little bit stronger, a little bit earlier in the year than our sun is. And so all that plays into soil temperature. And at planting time, May, it's all about soil temperature. So the warmer zones have the benefit of their soil warming earlier, and they have a little bit later early frost in the fall or first frost in the fall, and therefore they have a longer growing season. My last frost date is averaged to be about May 25th. But the garden soil, even in my raised beds, can still be quite cool and too cool for vegetables that like warm soil. It can also be still too cool for sowing some seeds. Some seeds like 15C, soil temperature 15C. Soil temperature 15C, not the outside temperature, because that's totally different. It varies from year to year, of course, but I'll just show you this photo that happened on May 15th a few years ago. All this to say, the safe bet is just to plan to wait until June to plant your warm season vegetables. Things like peppers, for example, they like warm soil. Just plan to wait till June and you'll be further off. And then my first frost is averaged to be around September 12th in the fall. So that means I have just over 100 frost-free days. But that doesn't mean I have 100 growing days, because the soil, depending on the year, that soil may be too cool for growing for all those 100 days. I kind of blame the garden centers for bringing in the plants too soon. We see them, we buy them, we want to bring them home, then we can't wait to get them in the garden. And I'm not saying don't buy them early. It's okay to buy them early, but you need the time, place, and resources to grow them on until you can get them into the garden. And by time, I mean they kind of have to be babysat a bit. They dry out quick. You need to watch the watering. They need a week or two to be hardened off properly, or else they're going to fry from the wind and the sun. Place means somewhere outdoors, or maybe in a greenhouse where it's sunny, it's nice and bright, but it's not subjected to cold or windy weather. Resources means that, if you buy them too early and they're already quite root bound, you have to hold them for another 2 or 3 weeks before you get them in the ground. They may need to be potted up into larger containers, and you're going to need potting soil for that. Again, it's dependent on the weather. You might have to hold them for 4 weeks, depending on when you buy them and the weather. Like I said, it's just better to wait until, probably the end of May. If you think it's the end of May and you're too late for buying stuff and getting your garden in, you're wrong. Because as I said, in May, it's all about soil temperature, and you're further off waiting for the end of May, or just before you know that it's safe to plant to the garden, you have everything ready, the soil's warm, buy them then. Chances are the garden center is going to have some new stock, or they're not going to sell out unless it's something really specific and there's only one of, then yeah, you'll have to get it then. But for the most part, if you're going to the garden center to pick up, a 6-pack of tomatoes or cucumbers or vegetables in that way, peppers, you're further off waiting and then planting them into warm soil. I use an old instant read kitchen thermometer, like a meat thermometer, one with a probe. I use one of those to take the soil temperature. It seems to work really well. I take that temperature at the depth I'm planting. So I'll dig a 4 to 6 inch hole and take the temperature there, where the roots are going to go. That's where I take the temperature. If I'm planting a tomato, say 6 to 8 inches down, I will dig that hole 6 to 8 inches down and figure out what the soil temperature is down there. Because if you take the soil temperature just an inch or two below the surface, it's going to be nice and warm. But that's not where the roots are going, or where the seed is going, or where the potato is going. For example, the soil temperature needs to be calculated where the seed or whatever root ball is going. That's where, even if you're just doing it by hand, you put your hand on the surface of the soil, put your hand a couple inches, dig a little bit away, put your hand down there, feel the difference, then dig an 8-inch hole and feel the difference down there. And you're going to feel the difference in the soil warmth. If it's nice and hot on the top, and then you dig a hole and it's comfortably warm down there, even if you don't have a thermometer, or steal your kitchen thermometer for a little while just to use, it doesn't wreck it. Mine is an old one, so I kind of use it just for that, but it doesn't wreck it. It's still good. You just have to wash it off. So still on the topic of soil temperature, I mentioned that it's not the same as the air temperature. Our air temperature is 20 degrees. You go and you take the temperature of the soil, and how is it only 10 degrees? And you have to kind of pay attention to that a little, especially if you're starting early, because everything likes a different temperature to germinate or start growing. Potatoes can be planted pretty early. They only need a soil temperature of about 8 C or 40, I think that is, 40 Fahrenheit, 46 Fahrenheit, to start growing. That's fairly cool. And I shoot for around Mother's Day generally to start potatoes. Carrot seeds, on the other hand, the soil needs to be twice as warm. They like a temperature of 15 C or 60 Fahrenheit in order to germinate. You can plant them as low as 10 C, but they're just going to sit there and they're not going to germinate until the soil temperature is right. My carrots aren't germinating is one of the most frequent spring vegetable comments that I see on gardening groups. It's a lot of people have that trouble, but the soil has to be warm enough. It has to be constantly moist as well. But soil temperature plays a big part. Cucumbers also like to be 15 C. If you're planting melon seeds, they need a soil temperature even warmer. They like a soil temp out of around 21 C to germinate, and that's why it's beneficial for you to start them in the house about 4 to 5 weeks ahead of time. 21 C is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty warm for a soil temperature. I start my melon seeds in the house on May 1st, and I start them on heat mats, and then just as soon as they pop up through the soil, as soon as I see some green, I move them out to the greenhouse. If it's warm out, you could do the same by putting them outside and growing them on for a bit that way. And I feel like I've mentioned this several times, but pepper transplants really resent being shoved into cold soil, and it can stall them. Won't kill them, but it can stall their growth for sure. And peppers also don't like soil temperature or air temperature below 10 degrees C at night. So there's kind of I mention this because a lot of people like to grow peppers, and there's a thing about growing peppers. They just like that warmth, and as long as you keep that in mind all the time, you'll be successful with growing peppers. So you see, there's no one date. I know we all shoot for May long weekend, but there's really no one date for all the vegetables in the garden because it does soil temperature does matter so much. The sun warms our black soil very quickly, and if you were to take that temperature in the morning and then again in the mid-afternoon, you'd notice a big difference. But it also cools off quite quick throughout the night. I utilize row covers early in the season, as early as I can get out there. I'll set up hoops and row cover, or even just lay row cover and secure it with some bricks over the soil. And that helps to keep the soil warm, and it warms it more during the day than what it would without the row cover. And it doesn't hold the heat at all for the night. However, because it's warmed up more, it warms it from 20 to 25, let's say, and then it loses 10 degrees at night. It's only, it's cooling down to 15 instead of to 10. So it's losing the same amount of heat, but it's warmer to begin with. I've taken the temperature of a row-covered bed and dug down a bit and taken the temperature again, and then I go over to a bed that is not covered, or soil that is not covered with row cover, and I do the same thing there, and the soil temperature, the difference is remarkable. Row cover also helps to stop the wind from wicking away all the moisture that might be in your soil, and it also keeps it warm enough for the seeds to germinate, especially seeds that like warmer temperatures, like beans and corn and carrots. They all like that warmer temperature. If you want to start your garden earlier, and you think that's your way forward, is to start your garden as early as you can, row cover is going to be a huge help for you in that regard, and I would seriously consider that. It's been a big help for me, and there isn't a year that goes by that I don't use row cover several times throughout the season, not just right at the beginning to warm the soil. I use it at the end of the season to extend the season a bit, like to allow the fruit to stay on the plant a little bit longer, like melons, for example. Last year I covered them with row cover just to keep that warmth a little bit longer, so that the last few had more of a chance to ripen. Many people don't have a garden plot, or you don't have a piece of your yard that can be turned into a garden plot, but that shouldn't stop you from growing vegetables. I have a raised bed vegetable garden, and it's more than enough for me. But year after year, I still plant zucchini in 5-gallon pails. For some reason, they just seem to do better for me in a 5-gallon pail than they do in the ground. They also take up a lot of space on the ground, and in a 5-gallon pail, they only take up the 5-gallon pail. The canopy of the plant may spread more, but it's not crowding out other plants. I can space those 5-gallon pails a little bit better, and that way I can do more intense planting in the raised beds. I've grown tomatoes and melons in 5-gallon pails as well. You can use extra large nursery pots, maybe the ones that a tree came in or something like that. 5-gallon pails, as long as you drill holes on the bottom. Whatever you use needs to have drainage holes on the bottom, several of them. And even if you make lots of them and they're a good size, and you put landscape fabric over or something for the soil to not leak out, the more drainage holes you can get on the bottom, really the better off you are. Now there's those grow bags. They seem to be plentiful, they're affordable, and they're easy to store. And I haven't tried yet. I'm going to try this year. I do have grow bags, but I just use them to store soil and compost and things like that. Last year, my compost hatched a nice big volunteer crop of sunflowers, and they grew beautifully in that grow bag. There is some benefit to the grow bag because it's permeable all the way around, and so there's more air at the roots, and that's helpful for the plant. Containers and raised planters and raised beds too, they all may need to be watered a little bit more frequently than a conventional garden plot. There's also self-watering containers and pots that you can look at as well if you're just not going to be there to be able to monitor the watering. Another idea is maybe you have a cracked or a leaking old kiddie pool. fill it with soil and turn it into a garden bed. Punch some holes on the bottom or drill some holes on the bottom first. Yeah, you can fill that with a soil mix and turn it into a small vegetable garden for sure, especially for things that are not very deep rooted. Laundry baskets can be used. You just have to, old laundry baskets or dollar store laundry baskets, you just have to line them with landscape fabric or maybe some burlap just to stop the soil from leaking out. And they would need, even though they might be kind of open on the sides, they would still need drainage holes on the bottom because you never want moisture, water sitting on the bottom and making it kind of soupy and stuff. So really the possibilities are quite endless what you could use to grow vegetables in. You just have to think outside the box a little bit. You know, a garden is just plants in some way. There's nothing that says that it has to be done in a certain way. The other option you might have is an allotment garden in the city that you live. Some places have them. If you're not sure where to find those, just call your city hall and ask them if they have such a thing and if you could be put on a list. Those aren't an option in any small town that I know of. But what I do know in small towns is that there's a lot of garden plots that are not going to use. Some people get older and they're not able to garden anymore, or there might be some physical problem, either temporarily or permanently, where somebody can't use their garden anymore. And so ask around, knock on some doors, find out if someone might be willing to either rent you their garden spot or let you use it, or to use even a part of it. I'll bet you dollars to donuts that you'd be able to use a part of it in exchange for some of the vegetables that you grow. And at the same time, if you're a new gardener and you're renting a garden space from an experienced gardener, gardeners always want to pass along their knowledge. So you would have the benefit of perhaps having someone teach you a few things as well. Just be sure before you get into it that you work out how you're going to use the water, if you can use the house water or maybe, help pay for the water bill. There's always that issue as well. Raised beds sit on the soil. They're open to the soil below. A raised planter has legs of some sort, and they have a solid bottom. On the bottom, the soil sits on some sort of a solid bottom. Raised planters are a little bit more difficult for some plants that are deep-rooted. And so if you have nothing and you're planning to go out and buy something or have something made or whatever, decide first what it is you want to grow. You don't want to go getting a container that's only 8 inches deep and then you want to plant potatoes. That's a bit extreme. If you don't know, potatoes would not grow in a container that's only 8 inches deep. And so decide first, figure out how deep of a container you're going to need before you go out and either buy or have it made or whatever. Deeper is always better when it comes to growing vegetables. There's some other plants, though, that are quite happy to grow in a shallower soil. Lettuce and spinach, herbs, and onion. They will all grow quite happily, for a while anyway, in a shallower soil. Shallow soil would have the benefit of warming up fairly early, but it also would get hot quickly, and there's some plants that don't like hot soil either. And speaking of soil, it can take a lot of soil to fill some of those raised beds, raised planters, big containers, and this is a stopping point for many people. What I do is I buy one of those great big bales of peat moss that's all compressed, and I mix it up in my wheelbarrow, and about a third of that wheelbarrow volume will be peat moss. About another third is my own compost, and then I add in maybe a half a bag of sheep manure, some slow release fertilizer if I have it, and also some potting mix, and I mix all that up. I also save my container soil from previous years, and I'll mix in some of that as well. And that would be for my pots. And on my raised bed, I will take those same type of components and just lightly turn it into the soil on the raised bed. If you're in the city, you can generally arrange a large dump of triple mix garden soil that is delivered to your driveway, either in a big heap or they have those great big bags that they lift onto your driveway. I also read that city compost areas give away compost in the spring to the residents of that city, and all you have to do is go with containers and pick it up. For small towns, we don't sometimes have those resources. I don't know how I would get a dump of triple mix here where I live, but I can get loads of black soil delivered fairly easily. And so for all of that I mentioned, either the triple mix or garden soil or black soil, that's great for on the ground growing. But if you're going to grow them in, if you're going to put that soil mix into containers, you will have to lighten it up some. That soil just gets a little bit too compressed in a container because you're frequently watering in a container. And so it just compresses a little bit more. You can add perlite, you can add peat moss, compost, a bit of sand. You can mix it up into just a little bit lighter of a mix. Again, in the wheelbarrow with a shovel, just keep turning and mixing and then fill your containers with that. And I mentioned at the end of the year, don't get rid of that soil. Just leave it in your containers. I have put great big black garbage bags over top of mine, and that's just to stop the moisture from getting in and maybe cracking or freezing and thawing, that kind of thing, and that would have to do with moisture. So I've taken those great big drum liners, put it over the container. It actually fits quite well, and I put a brick on top and I leave it there for the winter, and then it's not wet and saturated in the spring. That garbage bag does a good job of keeping all the moisture out. Then in the spring, spread a great big tarp in your backyard, dump your soil, or my big pots I don't take out all the soil. I take out about the top third and just put it all in a pile and just start mixing. Let your kids play in it for a day. They can do some of the breaking up for you. Take out all the big roots and just mix up a bunch of fresh stuff, and you're good to go. Don't throw away your soil at the end of the year. Most of that is soilless mix, and there's no nutrients in that anyway. All of that relies on fertilizer or extra things that you add, like sheep manure or slow release fertilizer or things of that nature, compost. But most of the potting mix that we buy, there might be a little bit of fertilizer in it, but it's very little. It usually will state the numbers on the bag if there is fertilizer in there. And so it's very little. It won't last for long. You always do need to add more into it. And for big containers, you can also cheat a bit. You don't have to fill it all the way to the bottom. You can use, get another pot and turn it upside down and put it on the bottom of the container, as long as it doesn't take up, say, more than a third of the container. You can also use sticks and dried stems, leaves, styrofoam if you have extra of that. If I put something like that, I like to take, the 6 cells, the plastic things, I like to crumple them up and put them on the bottom of the container. And then over top of that, I will put like a sheet of landscape fabric. You could also use burlap. You could actually even use like an old t-shirt or something, anything that is just not going to filter down and get that plastic all mixed up with the soil for when you do take it out. So that works. Essentially, depending on what you're growing, you want the top 2/3 of your container to have soil, and the bottom can be something else. It can be organic or it can be inorganic. You can use those big coffee cans or juice cans or things of that nature. You can just turn them upside down or keep the lid on and put them on the bottom. Just something to take up space on the bottom. It doesn't have to be rocks and it doesn't have to be heavy. Unless your container is one of those really tall, narrow things that might be a little bit tippy. If it's top heavy, then you would want maybe a brick or two on the bottom or a heavy rock or something just to prevent that from happening. But it is going to depend on what you're growing. For example, if you're growing a tomato in a 5-gallon container or a 5-gallon pot pail, you will need to fill that with soil all the way to the bottom because your tomato is going to root all the way to the bottom. So will a zucchini plant. You can also tuck vegetable plants into the landscape. A few beet seeds seeded in, say, a 2-foot circle in your flower garden is going to look beautiful. Those leaves are going to look really, really nice through the growing season. And then in the fall, you get to harvest beets. Lettuce can be planted the same way. It's nice, green, leafy, and then you can harvest it and make room for spreading perennials or your annuals. Lettuce, it has the benefit of being able to, you can plant it out a little bit earlier. It grows a little bit quicker, say, than your marigold next to it or whatever. And so by the time you're pulling out your lettuce, it's done for the season, or you've harvested the last one to eat, then your flowers are starting to spread out a little bit more. And carrots planted in the front of a sunny border would make a really nice ferny display for a while. And then at the end of the year, you get to harvest carrots. And peppers benefit from hot areas, really hot areas, like maybe against a sunny fence where you have trouble growing other things. Peppers can be quite decorative as well. When the fruit is starting to form on there or it's turning red, they can be decorative too. I think peppers are well suited to inserting into the ornamental areas of your yard because they're tidy. They're not sprawling all over the place. They're not all gangly like a tomato can get. And so I think they're quite well suited for that. They're just nice and tidy. They're a nice plant. Another plant that can be tucked in here or there is onion. You can take those sets and you can take 1 or 2 or 3 of the little baby onions that you're going to grow, and you can put them here and there and everywhere. As long as they get enough sufficient sun throughout the day to grow, you can grow them a lot of places, and they're just kind of like a nice upright. There's ornamental onion, why couldn't you grow just regular onion in along with your flowers? Another idea is to attach some netting or chicken wire or something like that to the fence, and you can grow cucumbers up that fence. You could plant pole beans on a teepee-like structure. That would make a fun secret room for the kids. And then in midsummer, you're harvesting beans. The pole beans I found are great plants to grow. You're growing vertical, so there's a lot of produce. There's a lot of beans on those stems that grow upward. And then at the same time, you can tuck edible plants into some of your flower pots. Or you could do an ornamental planting of just vegetables on your deck in a pot that you normally would use for flowers. There are dainty little plants, tomato plants that are, nice. They stay nice and small. I think one of them is called Red Robin. I grew that one a number of years ago. They will also grow in a little bit of a lower light situation. Pretty sure that's what it's called. I'm going to research it and I'll put it up on the screen if I'm incorrect about that. There's also those little mini snacking peppers. They're just like a little 2-bite pepper, and they grow by like loads of them on a plant. That would make a very colorful display, as well as you can just walk over and have yourself a snack of a pepper. You could do hanging baskets of red, orange, yellow cherry tomatoes, or maybe a big basket of one of each and have it sort of, a mixture of all those colors. That would look nice. Right next to it, you could have a nice hanging basket of strawberries. You could have smaller pots just overflowing with herbs like spearmint and basil, stevia, rosemary, oregano. You could have a lot of different kinds of herbs in a basket. You can also tuck in edible flowers into those edible pots. Calendula, nasturtiums, pansies, and bachelor buttons. They're all edible. Or do a big salad pot. You could have lettuce and spinach or salad greens. And on the side, you could have some onion and dill. At the back could be a tall, upright tomato. You could have some cucumber hanging down the front. some radishes, and maybe tuck in a pepper on it on the side, and there you go. Filler, thriller, and spiller. At a time now when a head of lettuce seems to be regularly getting to about $4 a head, that sounds pretty good to me, and I think I just might do a pot just like that. Seeds or plants? Well, for tomatoes, peppers, celery, parsley, many of the herbs, you will need to start with started plants, either the ones you purchase or ones that you have started or you're going to start on your own. Lettuce starts can be purchased. I see that they're often overgrown. You would do better planting those direct sowing seeds in the garden really as early as the beginning of May, and they germinate at a fairly cool temperature. Carrots, green beans, beets, onion sets, peas and corn, they should all be direct sown. I sometimes see transplants for these, and I'm actually, a little suspicious of them, and I'm curious as to how well they transplant or what the yield is, or what benefit there is to that when they can be direct sown. Melon plants, as I mentioned before, they can be direct sown. They just like that warm soil to germinate. So as I said, I always have started them indoors. You do have to take great care when you're transplanting because they don't like their roots disturbed at all. But I have rarely lost a plant to transplanting, so it can be done. Also, depending on what you grow, you may need some supports. If you're going to grow tomatoes, you'll probably need a tomato cage for each tomato. Might need some bamboo stakes, some twine, maybe some chicken wire. I use a lot of rebar stakes in the garden. That's my go-to for a lot of supports. You can also use sticks and lengths that you've pruned from your shrubs. I used to watch a fellow on TV long ago, and he always took prunings from his yard and stuck them into a soil around vegetables and flowers as support. And, genius really, because we're always throwing away our sticks or sending them off to the compost pile, and then we go out and we buy bamboo or some other type of staking method. I prune a lot of dogwood from the yard, and those are great because they are generally nice straight stems and they dry really strong. Don't use willow because spring pruned willow will root in the soil unless you want more willow, but that's what happens with willow. They root very easy into the soil. And I often have to stake peppers because they get so heavy with fruit that they start getting a little wobbly. And even if you're growing in a pot, they probably would still need staking. It just helps. It helps to keep the plant from falling over. They will actually still grow, but then, your peppers are on the ground. And anytime a vegetable is touching the ground in some way in that manner, like tomatoes or peppers, there is a chance of maybe some mildew starting to happen or a disease that could be soil-borne. So it's always good to keep your plants just elevated off the soil a bit. So you got everything planted, everything's growing. You need to think about fertilizer. If you've amended your soil with compost and maybe some sheep manure, that's going to help. Or mushroom compost is also a good one to use. If you're growing in mostly soilless potting mix, you're going to have to think about fertilizing because, as I said, there may have been a little bit of fertilizer in the potting mix that you've used, but it won't last. That soilless potting mix is essentially got nothing in it. It's got peat moss or coconut coir in it, and maybe some perlite. None of those things really have any nutrient value at all. They are simply a vessel to hold moisture to allow your plants to grow. If you want them to produce really well, you'll have to fertilize. Anything that grows from a flower, so a tomato, a cucumber, a pepper, peas, anything that flowers and then the vegetable grows from it, I fertilize with a high middle number. And I like the Miracle Grow Bloom Booster, the one in the yellow bucket. Well, it used to be a yellow bucket. I'm not sure if it is anymore, but it's 15, 30, 15. And I like to fertilize those plants with that. Anything green, they would, probably benefit from a higher first number, which is more nitrogen, like salad greens and things of that nature. There's also granular slow release fertilizers that you can mix into the soil, and they should last probably 6 to 8 weeks, or you would almost think, for the season. Root vegetables, if you're growing in a soilless mix, I'm not sure what they would need. I never fertilize root vegetables at all. They always seem to do just fine. But then again, I've never grown root vegetables, potatoes, carrots. I've never grown those, or beets. I've never grown those in a container. So I can't really advise on what kind of fertilizer, but I'm going to research that and put it on the screen. And you'll have to think about watering. And along with watering, I think about mulch, because mulch helps retain the moisture in the soil. Rain is for sure your friend when it comes to watering vegetable gardens. There's just something about rain that makes it so much better. Then you can pour all the water you want from the hose onto your veg garden, and it's not going to be the same as it does after a good rain. I have rain barrels, so I store rainwater, and I use every last bit of that before I start using water from the hose. If you don't have rain barrels set up to catch the runoff from your roof, I think it's worthwhile. It doesn't have to be fancy. Mine are some, I don't know what they are, 45-gallon drums, and then a couple of garbage bins, essentially, that are set up to catch the rainwater. I find it beneficial for the plants. I, of course, have also set up the sprinkler in the vegetable garden to give everything a nice deep soaking. There's some plants that don't benefit as greatly from having their leaves wet, but that would be constantly as opposed to occasionally. I don't think it hurts anything in the garden. Certainly when it gets rained on, the leaves get wet. I also started using some soaker hose and drip watering last year, and we're still playing with it, still trying to figure out the best way for the different varieties of plants that are grown. But that also works very well. It doesn't lose as much water. The water goes just where it needs to. If you're growing primarily in pots on your deck, you have a corner set up with a bunch of pots that are growing vegetables, or perhaps along a fence line, there's that drip irrigation. There's systems, kits that you can buy that are designed for that kind of use, either a bunch of pots all grouped together or along a fence line, like I said. I'm sure that there's all kinds of combinations. They can be set up on a timer as well. So you don't even need to think about it. It's great for people who are too busy, they travel, or maybe you want to grow your vegetable garden at the cabin and you're not there for watering, and so timers are really beneficial for that. I'm sure there's lots of places to look for those kits. I know of the ones at Lee Valley Tools, and as I've said before, it's free to go look at what kind of systems that different places have and how they can be accommodated for what you need. And I mentioned straw. I'm just going to mention that the last couple of years I didn't till potatoes. I planted the potatoes just under the soil surface, not too deep. And then after the potatoes emerged, I just started adding straw on top instead of hilling. It allowed me to plant quite a lot in a small space, and the potatoes at the end of the year were really easy to dig up. And there is a video on my channel about me digging up those potatoes at the end of the year last year, so you could see how that goes. But it was quite easy to dig up all those potatoes at the end of the year because they were almost right on the soil surface. I like mulching. I think mulching is great. It keeps down weeds. It keeps the soil cool. It regulates the temperature of the soil, or not cool. It keeps the soil at a more even temperature, so it's not getting really hot during the day and then really cooling off at night. It just keeps it at a little bit more of an even temperature, which plants like. It retains moisture, and that's a big one, especially in raised beds. And you can mulch even in pots. You just don't plant your plants right up to the lip of the pot. Plant them a little bit lower down, wait for them to get growing, and then add some mulch on top of that. In a pot, you'd need to, actually with anything for growing vegetables, you would need to use a fairly light mulch. So you wouldn't want to use those big bark chunks, for example. I wouldn't use any colored mulch. That's me. I wouldn't. I don't know what it's colored with, and so I don't want it going on my food that I'm going to eat. I mulch with straw. I prefer a cereal straw in the vegetable garden. In the ornamental beds, I've started using flax straw just so that it'll last a little bit longer. But in the vegetable garden, I like a cereal straw, so either wheat or oats is generally what I'll get. And I use it a couple of times. I'll use it and then I gather it all up and I put it off to the side, and then I use it again the next year. And then usually after that, I put it somewhere where there's just like under the apple tree or somewhere that needs a good layer of mulch. So I put it somewhere else for the permanent mulch. It breaks down over time, but I can probably get 3 or 4 years out of it before I think that it's, gone completely. I'm usually always adding, so it's difficult to tell really how fast it goes. Back to soil temperature. It's my favorite subject, I think. I've actually taken the temperature of mulch soil as well as unmulched soil, and again, there's a big difference. You can also see the difference. All you have to do is move away some mulch, and you can see the difference in the moisture retention as well on mulched soil as opposed to soil that is not mulched. But I wait until everything is up and growing before I do mulch the vegetable garden, and I generally wait for really good rain, or I wait for June rains to kind of be done, and then by the 1st of July, I'm thinking about, well, it's time to get the mulch on, and I like to do that after one big rain, so everything's had a really good soaking. I get that mulch on, and then it lasts a long time. If you are going to go that route and you're sourcing out straw, you do want to make sure that you're going to get straw without weed seeds. You're going to get some wheat or oats or whatever, barley, whatever it is that whatever kind of straw it is, you are going to get some of that growing. But I'll tell you, that is so easy to pull out, and some of it can be kind of decorative at the same time. So sometimes I pull it out, sometimes I don't. But you don't want something with thistle, for example. You don't want to introduce any bad weeds through the use of straw. Also, with respect to watering and moisture retention, I like to plant things into like a well, like a depression in the soil. And that's so the water doesn't drain away when I do water. That water pools in that area, and then it soaks in and it gets down to the root area. And I think that's quite beneficial. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers, melons, they all get planted that way in my garden, so that when I water, I can really get it down there and it's not draining away. It's giving the plant a really good soaking. Another use for rebar stakes or bamboo stakes in the garden is when I do plant melons, or pumpkin would be another, any of those vining plants, and I plant them into this depression in the soil. At some point, you can't see where those plants are actually planted. So I put a stake where the plant is planted, and then I know where to water. Then there's how to situate your plants, however you're growing them. So tall plants would always go on the north side of shorter plants. Shorter plants would go on the south side so that everything gets the sunshine. Some plants wouldn't mind the shade of a taller plant. Spinach and lettuce would be a couple of those that actually would benefit from at least midday sun, where it gets a little bit of shade and it provides a little bit cooler roots from the shade. And you also have to think about how big plants will grow, and I mentioned how big a zucchini can get. The canopy of zucchini can probably be probably a 3-foot circle, I imagine, maybe a little bit more. And so when you're setting out your garden, you want to think about how big that's going to get. So you don't want to plant carrots, let's say, right up close beside, even though that zucchini plant looks so small, you can't imagine how big it's going to grow. So you do want to space things out properly and give those big plants that kind of room to grow. And vining plants, there's bush cucumbers, but there's vining cucumbers, and pumpkin would be another. Any of those vining plants, the melons and the squash, they're going to get very long vines. The cucumbers themselves, which probably would be the smaller plant of that kind of family of plants, they can still get vines 4 feet, and pumpkin will take over the world. I think I used it once as a ground cover in a plot of land, actually what's now my vegetable garden. I wasn't planting anything there that year, but it was going to be just plain black soil, and I didn't want it full of weeds, so I planted a few pumpkin plants, and it absolutely covered that entire area, which is 25 feet wide or so, and 50 feet deep, I'm not sure, but yeah, it'll take over a big area. It wasn't a lot of pumpkin plants either. So just a few more things that you need to think about. I mentioned that I use row cover a lot. I use it to warm the soil in the spring and extend the season a bit in the fall. But I use hoops and cover of some sort extensively throughout the year. That row cover, first of all, is going to provide about, depending on the thickness, it'll provide between 2 to 4 degrees of frost protection. So there's that. And it also helps, the row cover also helps with wind protection. I plant melons, when I do plant the warm season plants, like the melons, the tomatoes, the peppers, and the cucumbers, I put row cover on all of that, and that just helps them to harden off a little bit. I think the way I have it set up, I can roll up half of the row cover and just pin it onto the hoops so that half of it is open, half of it is closed, and it just stops the wind from wanting to break everything all apart initially. Then you get a June like last year where it seemed like nothing would help. And if you want to grow any of the cabbage family, so that's cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, you are going to be bothered by the white butterfly. I haven't heard of anywhere that doesn't have this white butterfly, or cabbage moth is what they're frequently called. They sit on the plant, they lay eggs, those eggs turn into green worms, and those worms eat your plants while they're growing into new butterflies. And you need to protect your plants from that, or they're just going to decimate your plants. So if you're thinking about growing those, you have to think about getting netting at the same time, and some way to support the netting over the plants. If you're going to grow broccoli or Brussels sprouts, they grow quite high, and so you're going to need not just a little hoop that goes over, say, a cabbage plant. You're going to need something a little bit more substantial because they will grow quite tall. I have also in my yard have had to cover to keep the house sparrows away from eating the spinach and the lettuce and the beets. So I've covered with netting for that. Last year, I also covered the potatoes because I noticed a few potato beetles, and we used to be bothered by them a lot, and then I stopped growing potatoes, and so I've started growing the potatoes again, and that's my go-to now. Is if I see potato beetles, I cover up with some netting and they can't get to the plants that way. Potato beetles are also disgusting little creatures that that have to be picked off, or they'll eat your plants all up too. I have 8 raised beds in my vegetable garden area, and you can see them in my September garden check-in video, I think it is, and I can put a link to that at the end of the video or in the description box below. And I talk about them a little bit more there. Each one is 4 feet by 12 feet, and 10 inches high. They're made with 2x10s. Every year I draw out my plan and I move things around. I see where things were planted last year and the year before, and I make my decision on where things are going to go. There's a few things that I take into consideration, but I decide where things are going to go. I usually decide that while the garden is growing. In the current year is when I'm making the plan for next year. One of the reasons that I do that is because there's one rule that I follow, and that is not to plant beans after the garlic. And so I always like to know where the garlic is going to be planted the next year, because of course I'm planting it in the fall. And so that's one of the reasons that I like to have it all sort of sorted in my head of where things are going to grow. It's also a time when I can look and see, is there a problem here? You know, what might be an issue. If there was a melon problem, for example, something attacking, or say powdery mildew, that's often on melon or cucumber plants, then I would be sure not to plant any of the melon family in that area the next year. I'd plant potatoes or beets or something that is not bothered by powdery mildew in this example. So I use this Notability app, but there's all kinds of free-form drawing apps that you could use, or you can go old school with pen and paper. I keep this year to year so that I can look back. So aside from beans not following a garlic crop, I don't pay attention to any of the various suggestions for companion planting. It's just never been a thing. I've never had a problem in my garden that I can point to that and say, oh, it's because it's growing next to that. Aside from cabbage moths and flea beetles and the sparrows sometimes, although I think maybe I've got a handle on those now because I took away their where they like to roost the most. Aside from those issues, the only other issue I have occasionally is slugs. That's only if we get a good stretch of wet weather, and we seem to be getting that less and less. Now, I'll just mention that row cover can be purchased from a number of places. I've seen it occasionally at Co-op. Early's in Saskatoon has a lot of good sizes. They come in wider widths there. They have some very large pieces that you can purchase at Early's. You will need a wider width if you're going to use hoops, because the hoop, you need to accommodate for that. So if you have a 3-foot row of something, but you have a hoop over top of it, you're going to need a wider width to be able to go over that and still have some to secure it, to hold it down. I use landscape bricks mostly to hold it down. I've also used lengths of rebar. You could use water jugs filled with water, anything that's heavy, and you just need to be a little bit careful. I use bricks, so I have to be a little bit careful because they're rough and they can tear things. The netting I bought from Temu and from Amazon. I've not seen it on the shelf in a store, but then I've never looked for it either. But if you're going to go grow cabbage crops, you need the netting. If it's not flea beetles, then it's going to be the cabbage moth for sure. So I think that's about all I can think of when it comes to vegetable gardening. If you have some tips, tricks, ideas, suggestions, certainly chime in and leave a comment down below. I'll be posting lots of videos this spring and summer with kind of more of a hands-on type of content. I wish I could do that now, but I'll just show you that this is what my vegetable garden looks like today. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and watching today. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, if you did, give me a thumbs up. Tell your friends. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. Thanks again. See you.